unite and work together if we're all going to get through this.
Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero.
How heroic he comes
idiot. If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
Oh my god. People have, worms in your brain, honestly.
All right, welcome to episode 11 of the Sensible Socialist podcast. This week we are talking Russiagate. Yes, the situation that's going on that everyone's talking about, Trump collusion, Robert Mueller, all that kind of stuff. But what you'll find is that this discussion is much more wide-ranging than just Russiagate, because I think in the narrow-minded focus on issues with Russia, we've lost a bit of perspective. So this week I'm talking with Michael Melinchok. Michael Melinchok is a member of Socialist Alternative in the District of Columbia, and he is a student of Western European history and just a wealth of knowledge, who has a lot of different ideas, has thought a lot about these kinds of things. And the reason that I had Michael on was he had actually written a good Facebook post, sort of focused on liberals, and that Facebook post really generated some interest of mine, and a number of people commented on it, and I thought that would be a good way to jump into the discussion. So without further ado, here is my talk with Michael Melinchok. I guess I'll just start out by saying welcome. It's the first person that I'm talking to in person, so it's a sort of seminal event. But Michael Melinchok, why don't you give us a background on who you are, and I lead that, if you can, give a background just who you are generally, but lead that into how you got into socialism and stuff like that, because I think that's a good place for a lot of people to start, just to kind of get an introduction as to who you are.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah. So I've had a roundabout political evolution, and I'm probably one of the few socialists that maybe started out as a Republican early in life. And just to give a little bit family background, I grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, Rust Belt, USA. My dad was a steel worker, Bethlehem Steel, for 40 years. His father was a miner. My parents, my mom's side, came from the South. They were poor sharecropping family in South Georgia. So very stereotypical working class background. I made good, went to college, got thrown out once and quit once, and went on to get a PhD in European history. Started out politically as what I would call, it's sort of an oxymoron today, a liberal Republican. A lot of folks don't remember, but back in the 60s, 70s, and even into the early 80s, there were liberal Republicans. So I was always very liberal on social issues, probably not any more to the left than I am now on things like civil rights or women's rights. I call myself a feminist in high school in the late 70s, which was, guys just didn't do that. But so I was out there on the left for a lot of issues, but I think I just got sort of sucked into that American exceptionalism and American patriotism and American nationalism and the Reagan Revolution. I never called myself really conservative. I always called myself a progressive Republican, liberal Republican. Yeah, I'm not religious. I never was. I never bought into the Christianity that my parents were into. Never bought into racism or any kind of other kind of prejudices, really. So that's pretty much my background. So I evolved really. I guess when I started graduate school in the 90s, I realized that not everything I taught I was taught in K through 12 was really true, and that America and exceptionalism is just a myth, and America doesn't win all its wars. All its wars are not just. A lot of them are unjust. America is not the beacon of democracy. We often overthrow democracies around the world. So I really start to change. I would say by the 90s, I didn't really consider myself affiliated with any political party. I would still call myself a progressive. Probably by the 2000s, I was more of a leftist. I haven't voted Republican since the 90s, and held my nose to vote for Al Gore in 2000. And probably since the 2000s, I've just been drifting more to the left the more I've read. Yeah, I read Marx and Engels 35 years ago when I was in college, and I thought what they said was true for the 19th century. The Communist Manifesto was a great thing in 1848, but did we need that in the 1960s or 70s in America? No. I mean, my dad, even though he was a blue-collar guy, barely finished high school, we had a good middle-class lifestyle. We went on nice vacations. My sister and I went to college. We had that blue-collar, middle-class American dream.
Yeah.
And I just assumed everybody could attain that. And I realized that was almost an anomaly, that period, say, from the 40s until maybe the 70s, where tens of millions of blue-collar folks in this country had a middle-class lifestyle.
Yeah.
They did not before the Second World War, and they sure haven't had it since the 80s and 90s with stagnant wages, actually even falling wages for working class blue collar type jobs. So a lot of folks in this country have seen their living standards decline. And so I realized all these things were going through my head in the 90s and 2000s. And so I came around maybe like 4 or 5 years ago to realize I have to do something about it. I can't just shout on social media and scream at the TV set. So about 3.5, 4 years ago, I joined Socialist Alternative. And because I realized that I was a socialist, I was a Marxist. I wanted to be in a party that really took politics seriously, that actually wanted to take action beyond simply talking about overthrowing capitalism. Like, what are we doing today to help people? So the idea of the $15 minimum wage, the idea of free public higher education, many of the ideas that Bernie Sanders later popularized, I was thinking about those a couple years before Bernie ran. And so I was thinking, like, okay, what kind of party exemplifies these? And I learned about Shama Sawant, the struggle for 15 in Seattle, Socialist Alternative, started to read more about it. So early 2015, I joined Socialist Alternative as a member. I helped start the DC branch here in the nation's capital, and I've been involved ever since. I think this is probably what I'm going to be doing the rest of my life because I think it's a really great organization. I met people like you and lots of other good folks that really want to make positive change in this country and in the world.
Well, I think what's awesome too is just the idea that you are looking at later years and wanting to do something, whereas a lot of people, I think, are looking towards their later years as the time to do nothing.
Right. So my idea of retirement, and I'm actually going to retire from the federal government. I won't say what agency. In about 4.5 years, and so that's really the beginning of my next career. And my next career is hopefully to be a full-time socialist revolutionary. I know it sounds trite, but I really want to get involved in some of our campaigns and volunteer my time and labor and knowledge to do what I can to help the party, to help people maybe running for a city council seat or a county council seat. I simply relocate there for 6 months and help work on the campaign. I mean, that's a fun retirement to me. No. Not going on a damn cruise or going to Hawaii and sitting on the beach for 2 weeks.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to be more useful.
A proletarian retirement, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
One thing that I would be curious about is that I think there might be a lot of people who would have maybe called themselves progressives or would call themselves liberals or something, who may have not, held their nose, voted for Al Gore, but then maybe voted for Barack Obama and thought, all right, that is still on that kind of neoliberal perspective. Whereas you kind of made the break and said, okay, I'm a Marxist. Now, you were already familiar with it in the way that maybe a lot of people aren't as familiar with it because it was something that you had studied, having to learn about European history.
Right. Yeah, my specialty was 19th to 20th century European history. So even as an undergraduate, I knew who Fourier and Owen and Marx, Engels and Trotsky and Lenin. Yeah. I read all these guys, and I thought, okay, that's great. Like I said, the communist
thing.
Yeah, the Communist Manifesto was great for the 19th century. The Russian Revolution was a good thing, but then it turned into Stalinism.
Yeah,
and really a bad thing at the time. And so. Yeah, so I knew the facts. I knew a lot of the background that a lot of folks that don't have that background would not know. But it still took me a while. It still took me an evolutionary cycle. And I did vote for Obama in 2008, 2012, because I was actualized as a leftist, but I didn't really know who to vote for. I still had that mentality of, I have to vote for the lesser of two evils. That if I vote for Jill Stein or Ralph Nader, that's going to dilute my vote and it's going to go to the Republicans. So I still had that mindset. I've fortunately come out of that mindset because I realized if we keep voting for the lesser of two evils, as some rock star once said, we keep voting for evil. And I've stopped voting for evil. I have to vote for people who I really trust and believe in.
Yeah, I as much as that maybe seems like a bad thing to do in the age of Trump, it wasn't because people were not voting. A lot of people are voting against Hillary Clinton and not necessarily voting, for Trump. But so, well, one other question I have would just, was there something that made a sort of break? Like, was it Occupy, or was it something that made you kind of go, all right, like, I can't keep going on this liberal train. I gotta make the switch. Was it
right?
single event?
There was an actual event, and that was when Scott Walker in Wisconsin tried to break the teachers' unions. This was like 2014, 2015, around there, and so that's when I really said, you know, I had been identifying as a leftist for a number of years, but I believed in the hope and change of Obama. That, okay, he's going to be different.
Yeah.
And you know, just the fact that he was the first African American in this country to be elected president, it was a watershed event.
Yeah.
Regardless of his politics.
Sure.
And I remember, you know, watching the election returns that night, and when they announced, like, at 8:00 or 8:30, 9:00, that Barack Obama mathematically was 100% going to be the next president of the United States, I started bawling. Because I'm old enough to remember overt racism everywhere.
Right.
I worked at places that wouldn't hire black people when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
I remember how black people got treated back then in the 60s and even into the 70s. And so that was just so important for me. But the thing is, we realized, I think both you and I, that it was just another neoliberal, that he would just keep implementing the same policies that favored big business, that favored the corporations, that favored the wealthy, give a few, you know, crumbs to the working class, you know, maybe support a few hot button issues like you know, abortion or gun control, or at least mouth support for those positions, but not really take anything that would disrupt the corporate control of America.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I worked for the Obama campaign because I thought, yeah, I mean, it's the guy could really, I mean, I read the books, you know, and if you read Obama's books, it's a different Obama than got elected and became President Obama to me. You know, I was convinced by something that I quickly realized wasn't true, especially when the bailout sort of fully went through and was a giant giveaway. It was kind of like, oh, okay, you had the opportunity in that first few 100 days. You know, if you're judging the efficacy of the change that's going to come out by a president, it's in that first 100 days of the first presidency, like FDR, which is where it comes from. And that's the difference between the first 100 days of FDR and the first 100 days of Obama, given the similarity of the economic situation they were in, couldn't have been more different.
Right. I think while many people have a very positive view, rightly so, of Barack Obama, his wife Michelle, their kids, you know, very nice people, you know, exemplary background and lifestyle. You know, personally, he's the type of guy I would love to meet, to have as a neighbor, to have as a friend. But it's just his policies are the same old. And I think really seriously, historians are going to be a lot harsher on Obama than people are now in the age of Trump.
Yeah.
People long for Obama. Even Republicans who are anti-Trump long for the days of Obama. But I think 20, 30 years from now, people are going to realize the reason we have Trump is because of Obama's continuation of corporate democratic policies.
Yep.
I mean, you probably know that just this one factoid that during the 8 years of the Obama presidency, the Republicans gained 816 state representative and Senate seats across this country. They basically now dominate the state legislatures in this country, and that all happened under Obama's watch because of lack of grassroots involvement, that there wasn't a motivation for people to get involved because the Democratic Party doesn't really provide much for working folks. And now they're aghast that you know, enough people didn't vote for Hillary to win over Donald Trump. And it's really because so many people are rightly so turned off of politics because both political parties, the Democrats and Republicans, are garbage. They offer the working class nothing. So people say, both parties are the same old shit. That's a fact. And we can't deny it. We can't tell people to get involved because the Democrats are different. How are they different? On a couple hot button issues like abortion, gun control, like I mentioned earlier. On most things that affect people, whether they know it or not, monetary policy, trade, tariffs, all these kind of things, both parties are on the side of the rich. As Chomsky has said, you know, you and I know this quote, you know, we basically have one political party in this country. It's called the Wall Street Party. Right. It has two branches, the Democrats and the Republicans.
Yeah, it's exactly, that's what I've always said, that the country's it's a one-party state. It just has two factions, and they just happen to call themselves different parties. But it's basically the same thing. Okay, so getting to the purpose for the conversation today is circling back to everyone's friend Trump, because and part of the reason, one of the reasons that we're you having a background in European history means that you and I could have a number of long conversations about the twists and turns of European history and how that helps to understand where we are, but. You had written a post on Facebook that was a longer post, which I think a lot of people tend to go, oh God, a long post on Facebook, I'm not reading it. Like if I push see more and it's not 2 sentences, I'm not reading it. But I read the whole thing and I thought it was great. Oh God, there's a cat here, so there's a good chance that you might hear some meowing. But you made 5 points that you wanted to kind of communicate to the liberals, and what I kind of thought would be interesting, just because I thought they were right on the money, is just to kind of go through them a bit and sort of expand on it a little bit and kind of take each point by point. So one thing that we saw, especially after the Helsinki summit between Putin and Trump. This after just the few days before, there was an indictment of 12 Russian operatives of certain organization and affiliation with different Russian organizations. That's part of this whole Russiagate scandal, which if the listeners don't know about it, then I can't help you. Like, there's tons of summaries. All you have to do is turn on Rachel Maddow on any given night, and she'll give you the breakdown of anything that you need to know.
Google Russiagate.
Yeah, Russiagate. It's essentially a hack of the DNC to release real emails that were then sowed seeds of doubt in the minds of some people enough to potentially sway the election, supposedly done by Russians and given to WikiLeaks. So it is a Russia WikiLeaks Facebook kind of not conspiracy necessarily, but orchestrated event in order to dissuade Americans from voting for Hillary Clinton so that enough would vote for Trump.
And there's also the added idea that the Russians had basically like bots on Facebook and other social media. They had basically professional paid trolls who were trolling comments, who were trying to start arguments, trying to create chaos in a lot of political posts on major social media sites, which probably did happen. But we're doing the same thing, of course. Lots of countries doing this, and the idea that somehow paid operatives in some basement office building in Kiev or in Moscow making comments on Facebook posts or on Twitter are somehow interfering with our election to the extent that it's persuading millions of people to vote differently. It's just garbage.
One thing on that it'll lead us into it, but I'm curious about is one of the things that's talked about in that, and I understand this, is that there is a difference between Russians or anyone hacking into, using a spear phishing to get a campaign to get someone to put in their password so that you get the password to a bunch of other stuff, and not having the knowledge to know like what's a spear phishing email and what isn't. That aside, if the Russians hacking something and giving out real material that sows the seeds of doubt and calls into question some things that is essentially sort of government-backed kind of information, which isn't always the most reliable and is subject to a lot of distortions and administrative perspectives and things like that. That's different than a hack of machines to change votes. Would you'd agree with that?
Oh, of course. Yeah,
okay, so if there is evidence, I read an interesting article that suggested that there is some circumstantial evidence that they're not sure if it's Russians. I mean, the assumption is Russians, but that there have been hacks of voter lists in states like Georgia who don't have paper backups and whose machines are subject to being fairly easily hacked. And so, and there's evidence that they were at least accessed, but there's no concrete evidence that they were actually votes changed. Would it make a difference to you if votes were actually changed in the dynamic of all of this?
Well, I think it would, especially if there's a trail that leads it back to Russia. Again, this could simply be, it could be other bad actors. It could be the Republican Party. It could be some local official trying to manipulate the vote for his or her particular candidate at the presidential level or at other levels.
Yeah.
So we'd have to really look at the evidence there to see where it goes to. I think there are problems with our electoral system simply because it's run by the states, and so there's 50 different systems and 50 different ways of doing things and 50 different security policies.
Private
and some are
involved.
better than others. Some contractors are probably very legitimate. Some are much less so. And so I think there could be significant electoral reform in this country, not just on how we vote and the composition of Congress, or should we go to a parliamentary system or whatever, but the actual ballot process I think can be improved a lot.
Yeah. So that it's just an interesting thing, because if there seems to be a distinction between actual vote changing and like sowing seeds of doubt by using legitimately sounding, or at least plausible kinds of disinformation campaigns to sow the seeds of doubt and division within the U.S. population. I mean, it seems to me that there's an important difference between those two things.
Oh, definitely.
But so the first thing that you said, the kind of first point that you made in your post was that Trump isn't a traitor. And I thought that was interesting because there was a lot of talk about that after that Helsinki thing, where that Trump doesn't suggest that, well, Putin denies it, so, I got to take his word for it, even though the agencies say something. And apparently this whole idea that Trump's not siding with U.S. intelligence agencies over the denial of the president of Russia is somehow tantamount to treason. And I don't know if you can read what you wrote, or you can just kind of say what you think about that. But I think the point that you made about that was an important one.
Well, let me do both. So this Facebook post that you were referring to that I posted right after the summit, because I'd start to see things on social media where you see the White House in red with a hammer and sickle, as if Russia is still a communist country. You have the very homophobic pictures of Trump and Putin, shirtless on horseback, touching each other in suggestive ways, and all this other garbage that not that I'm in any way, shape, or form a fan of Putin, who is really more of a neo-fascist or an authoritarian of the right. Certainly not a communist, but it seems that the quote liberal establishment is really starting this almost like McCarthyite type of anti-communist fervor, when they don't even realize, first of all, Russia's not communist, even though Putin was a colonel in the KGB. And he was nominally a communist then, but I think like many people in the last decades of the Soviet Union were authoritarian of some sort or another because they have no other background, but not necessarily married to the ideas of Marx and Engels. And so I think Putin's career after he leaves the KGB is just basically of someone out for his own gain, out for political power, and using more authoritarian right-wing methods than any kind of a left message at all. So to answer your question, I think I'll read what I wrote because it is sort of succinct. I mean, it was a long post, but it was really just like 7 or 8 reasonably short paragraphs. So my response to seeing all this sort of liberal McCarthyite, Trump's a traitor type of thing, he's under the pay of communists, he's owned by Putin, was that, first of all, Trump is not a traitor. He's certainly dangerous, he's delusional, he's narcissistic, he's an imbecile, I'd go that far. Most incompetent U.S. president ever, sure. But he's not a traitor because treason is very narrowly defined by our Constitution as levying war against the United States or giving aid and comfort to its enemies. Jane Fonda in Hanoi, sitting behind the anti-aircraft gun, was not a traitor because the United States wasn't at war. She was never prosecuted. Very few people have even been prosecuted for treason since the Second World War because it's very specifically defined in the Constitution. The U.S. is not at war with Russia now. Did the Russians work to disrupt or influence the 2016 presidential election in this country? Of course they did. The U.S. government interferes with elections all the time. We overthrow governments by force, either directly or through proxies, all the time. Nothing new here. Trump is not a traitor, and so that's really just a ridiculous comment to make because it makes the liberals look like ignoramuses. We know Trump is a nitwit. Why should the liberal establishment that's fighting against Trump make themselves look just as stupid?
Yeah, I mean, you said words matter, and I think that's the thing that is really important, is that it doesn't have to be treasonous to be bad, and it doesn't mean because it's not pro-American that it's treasonous. And I think that the conflation of that kind of treasonous stuff with all of the the sort of Putin Trump stuff, and especially the hammer and sickle stuff. I said this to a friend too. The use of the hammer and sickle stuff is perfectly plays into the Democratic Party, like what they want to do right now. It's this, we want to get at Trump and we want to get at like Bernie and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the sort of red part of our blue party, right? So, remember hammer and sickle, bad. Remember Putin when you think of like something communisty, not Bernie Sanders.
That's a great point. I mean, I guess we're just waiting for the comparisons now. If Bernie actually officially announces he's going to run in 2020, people calling him a communist and people saying, well, he's like Putin, he's a communist.
Exactly. Yeah, I can see all of that on the horizon, and it's again having to go back to the definitions and say what do we even mean when we're using these words, and do you know what you mean when you use words and symbols? And
getting back to what you talked about, the idea that this press conference in Helsinki that Trump basically disparaged U.S. intelligence agencies and the FBI. I mean, that in and of itself is not necessarily treasonous. I mean, if you look at the activities of the CIA and the FBI, not just internationally, overthrowing governments left and right, supporting right-wing coups, supporting fascist governments, Franco in Spain, Salazar in Portugal, just to name 2 of 50. But if you look at their activities in the United States, you look at the murder of Fred Hampton, and the attacks on Black Panthers, on the anti-war movement, and the civil rights movement. We're not just talking about disparaging things. We're talking about killing people. The FBI and the CIA have killed Americans. They have undermined legitimate civil rights organizations, anti-war organizations. They've infiltrated them. They've done things that are felonies across the board, never been indicted. No agent from the FBI has ever been arrested for Fred Hampton's murder or the murder of dozens of other civil rights workers or anti-war activists. So the FBI and the CIA have not been held accountable for their actions over the last 50 years. I wouldn't trust them either. Because when you think about it, who do the CIA and the FBI work for? They work for our government, which is pretty much owned and operated by and for the ownership class, Bernie's 1%, the capitalist class. They are not working for the working people. They are working for the establishment. And I don't trust them either.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
So that's one thing I would. It's horrible to say it, but that's one thing I would probably agree with on Trump. In that I don't trust him. Now he's doing it for very different reasons. He's doing it for very different political reasons. I'm doing what I think are for real rational reasons. Is that they have done horrible things to Americans in this country and been not held accountable for it.
And that's why this sort of change from where criticism of or suspicion about the FBI and the CIA is something healthy and something warranted because of Iraq and then all of the things that the FBI does, including screwing up things like at Waco and all those sorts of things. That turning that around because now they're the tribalistic kind of way of saying now that they're against my enemy, they're my friend now. And I'll forget all of the stuff, including, the FBI was held civilly responsible in a civil court case for Martin Luther King Jr.'s death. So, the CIA, the FBI killed Martin Luther King. And so the idea that the FBI is an institution that you should trust and that you place the literal future of the country on is so asinine and so backwards and so nearsighted that it bothers me a lot that people that you can't see 2 inches in front of your face to be able to say. But I thought it was actually, that being said, people are, because James Comey had a quote, or had a tweet where he said something like, I hope that the Democrats don't go, or liberals don't go to the socialists, because what we need right now is fair and even-headed leadership or something like that. And the Hampton Institute replied back that just said, the FBI killed Fred Hampton.
Yep. I saw that post as well.
At least they're there.
Yeah, the liberals who oppose Trump now will latch on to any group or organization that's fighting Trump, whether they are good or bad. And that's very dangerous, not just for them in the idea of trying to get Trump out of office, but it's also bad for the country in the sense that we're giving renewed trust and authority to these agencies that in the past have done horrible things and in the current day still do horrible things.
Yeah.
The federal government is actively tracking Black Lives Matter members as potential subversive people in this country, which is ridiculous.
Right.
No crime or no criminal activity has ever been pinned to Black Lives Matter in its whole existence, and it's not even a real coherent organization. It's a group of small organizations around the country, and the idea that people are trying to infiltrate them, the government is trying to infiltrate Black Lives Matter and try and keep tabs on it as a potential terrorist organization, is just idiotic.
Yeah, but idiotic, yes, new, no, and that's I think the frustrating thing. It does though lead into the second part of what you had written, which is that there is this single-minded focus on Trump, especially with the Russiagate stuff, because it's like, oh, if we can just get Trump, that Trump is actually the problem. If we target Trump and get Trump out with an impeachment by having a blue wave in 2018 and all this kind of stuff, that we're good to go. And your post kind of shut that down. So
right, because again, when I talk to liberal friends in person or interact with them on social media, they tend to have so much of a focus on Trump. I really don't have much of a focus on Trump myself. Even though I do believe he is pretty much a neo-fascist, he's really leaning toward that right-wing authoritarian type of rule. It's the whole system that's responsible. And as I said in this post, that Trump is only the symptom of far deeper problems in this country. Now, would impeaching Trump and removing him from office be a good thing? Sure. The problem is we'd still have Mike Pence at the helm and a Republican Congress. We'd have a smarter and more friendlier version and more saner version of Trump at the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
So even in the 2018 elections, even if they change the latter part of that equation, that we have a Democratic House, for instance, Pence will still make nice with the Democrats as the reasonable alternative to Trump. And of course, we know the Democrats will respond and play nice with the sexist, homophobic, racist, xenophobic, corporate-owned President Pence. They will, because he's a nice guy. He was a member of Congress. He was a governor.
He's one of us.
He's one of us. He's the opposition, but we work across the aisle.
Right, yeah.
Even if the guy's a fascist.
It's a good sign of bipartisanship.
Yeah, we'll be bipartisan homophobia. Sure, we'll try and tone him down a little bit.
Yeah.
So even in 2020, the Democrats have very little to offer working people. Fake progressives and sellouts to the corporate oligarchy for the most part. And people see that. If you think the Democrats are a sure thing to recapture the presidency in 2020, we need to think again.
Yeah, and this is something that it's a weird place, because even if the Mueller investigation does find, collusion, I think they've already found impeachable offenses, frankly. The only reason he's not been impeached is because it's a Republican-controlled Congress. But that being said, that impeaching Trump, first of all, Trump is not Nixon, so Trump is not going to resign. And the idea that you're going to go through an impeachment like we went through in 1990, what was that, 4 or 6? I can't remember, what the Monica Lewinsky thing. That put a standstill to everything else that was going on. Things happening in the world that need to be responded to that are totally distracted because the president's under investigation or on trial in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that, of a Donald Trump, the witnesses that you're going to have in the Donald Trump impeachment trial in the U.S. Senate in 2018, to me just seems like a horrible thing for everyone's mental health, if nothing else. But then, even if it's all successful, what you have is a what you have is a Pence, right? And Paul Ryan, I guess maybe he'd be out, but if Trump were impeached before Paul Ryan is done, that means Paul Ryan could be potentially, once he gets done as Speaker of the House, he becomes Vice President, putting himself in the, ability to be second in command if something were to happen to Pence. Nothing changes with an impeachment of somebody like Donald Trump. Just like nothing really changed with the looming impeachment of Richard Nixon. That's seen as an important event, but immediately you had Gerald Ford who came in, who did a pardon, and so this focus on getting Trump out of office is again another symptom of that nearsightedness and not being able to see the deeper, more fundamental problems with the system. And I think that you kind of go into that with the sort of next part of what you said, which is, I think, a perfect encapsulation, and it leads into something that I kind of wanted to talk about too, but of what the real problem is.
Right. So yeah, the third point I made in this little essay was that really the far deeper problems that gave us the Trump-Pence regime and the Republican domination of the federal and state governments really center on the absolute bankruptcy of the Democratic Party and the increasingly massive income inequality in the United States. Like Pence and the Republican Party, the Democratic Party is largely owned by Wall Street and your local Chamber of Commerce. Yes, even Barack Obama. All of them. The Democrats have done virtually nothing to support unions in recent years. Once the backbone of the Democratic Party, they have openly opposed increases in the minimum wage, Medicare for all, tuition-free post-secondary education, and a host of other issues. The Democrats support business interests and the interests of the wealthy donor class above all others. They are essentially GOP light. The rich are literally getting richer, and the middle class and working class are literally getting poorer year after year after year, and the Democrats essentially do nothing but give lip service to that problem. Many working class folks have wisened up to this, and they either have given up on politics, both parties are shit, which is indeed a true statement, or are attracted to populist messages on the left, the phenomenon Bernie Sanders in 2016, or the right, the phenomenon of Donald Trump and the Tea Party in recent years.
And yeah, I mean, the difficult thing for me, and I mean, you, that of this faith in the Democratic Party, I find it fascinating. There's another cat, but I find it fascinating the ability for the Democratic Party to sort of play the role that it plays. You know, you did have that wonderful moment where Nancy Pelosi was surprised by the young college student who asked her, you know, are you guys going to go left on economic issues because that's where young people are? And she was just like, oh, like, no, we're capitalists, and like that's just the way that it is. And so, you know, obviously the people that are in favor of the Democratic Party sort of play the tribal game that the whole thing is the Republicans' fault, you know, that the Republicans are the ones that have pulled the party apart or pulled the country apart and all of that. The role of the Democratic Party in bringing us to the situation that we're in today. I mean, do you okay, that's an interesting sound. But do you lay that on the feet of I mean, what accounts for this sort of situation we find ourselves in with the Democratic Party? I mean, a lot of us, I think, learned in our high school history classes or something that there was a period of time that, I mean, I had a grandpa who you'd think would be, based on his background, be like a hardcore conservative, but he was a hardcore Democrat because of FDR and the New Deal, you know. And I think that there are those like sort of older Democrats, but what do you think happened to the Democratic Party? Was it ever really a party of the people? Has it always kind of, you know, because it does have a not so pretty past in terms of the Civil War era and things like that. So what I'm curious about is your thoughts on the trajectory of the Democratic Party and how did we get here, and is the Democratic Party salvageable?
Well, I think it's important to note historically a couple of facts that many Americans today might not be aware of. And that is, we basically have had a two-party system since 1860, the Democrats and Republicans. But before the rise of the Republican Party in 1856, we had a Whig Party. Mm-hmm. So the current two-party system we have now dates back about a century and a half. It's important to know for most of that century and a half, the Democrats and the Republicans were not necessarily liberal or conservative. That is, the big issues of the day tended to focus on things that would be hard for us to classify as conservative or liberal today, maybe with the exception of slavery. Mm-hmm. So, but if you take out slavery, if you look at the Democrats and Republicans in the late 19th century, early 20th century, what were the big issues of the day? Tariffs. Should we have basically taxes on foreign goods coming in the country to help support domestic industry? Free coinage of silver, something that, what does that mean today? The idea that we could have more easy money and easy credit, that we could have not just a gold standard, but a dual standard of gold and silver coinage, which in the days before the wide acceptance of paper money was a big issue in the 1880s, 1890s. And going into the 20th century, the progressive era, when we had reforms about, public initiatives and recall elections, all these things, there was a progressive wing of the Democratic Party and a progressive wing of the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, me coming of age a couple decades before you, Kevin, I'm growing up in the 60s, starting to become politically active in the 70s, voting in my first election in 1980, there were liberal and Democratic wings that were conservative and that were liberal.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that the Democratic Party only played to the working class was only true in large cities in the North. It wasn't true in the South, because in the South, up until the 1960s, the Democratic Party was the party of segregation, of racism, of the Klan.
Mm-hmm.
The Klansmen weren't Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
That's only later on. So there was a shift really in 1980 when Ronald Reagan captured the White House, and that the Republican Party became more exclusively conservative. It became more exclusively the conservative position on many issues, whether it's abortion, gun control, whatever. And the Democratic Party started to shift to more liberal positions, which was really cemented maybe a bit earlier, like George McGovern's run for the presidency in 1972. The Democrats shifted more to the left, and then the Republicans shifted more to the right. So now, let's say by the 1990s, you have really two ideological parties. The Democrats are more liberal left, the Republicans more right conservative, more like the European or political parties in other parts of the world, which tend to be ideological. We did not have that history of ideological parties. They tend to be regional and on particular issues that weren't necessarily conservative or liberal. Parts of the country like the South were traditionally Democrat. The Midwest, the West, was traditionally Republican. Large cities tend to be more Democrat. Rural areas, Republican. But it wasn't that strict sort of liberal conservative divide. So getting back to your question, after looking at that history of the Democratic Party in our system, is there hope for the Democratic Party? Is it salvageable? I would think the answer is a qualified no, in the sense that personally, I'm in Socialist Alternative. I'm a Marxist. I believe in that we need the triumph of socialism over capitalism. As you know, we really need capitalism to create that vast amount of wealth to create a fair and just socialist system. But we need to have socialism because that capitalist system tends to concentrate that wealth in fewer and fewer people over time, as Marx explained. You really need to have a socialist system replace it, or basically capitalism will just destroy this planet. And I think the Democrats, as Nancy Pelosi aptly said a few months ago, we're a capitalist party. So if the Democrats are saying out loud, we are a capitalist party, we support capitalism, they're basically saying we're not a socialist party. We don't support socialism. If that's really the leadership of the Democratic Party and that's how it's going to continue, they're going to die out.
And that, I think that brings, beautifully into the kind of next point that you were making, which is that basically because the Democrats and the Republicans are at this point two segments of the billionaire class or the billionaire party, that it's your position that we really do need a new party, and something that would be a socialist party, and so something that you said that I think is sort of necessary. Well, you said, Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign set off light bulbs atop millions of American heads, turning them on to some of the basic ideas of social democracy and socialism, a society where corporations and the rich actually pay taxes and the government works for the people, not the billionaire class. There is obviously been something that's awoken in the general American sort of zeitgeist and in the spirit of the times, and so what do you think is the thing that's necessary for us to take the light bulbs that have been turned on and really shine them in the right direction? What do you think is needed? Obviously a new party, but what do you think we really need to do?
I think before we even try to get our head around the idea of starting a new party that will successfully attract millions of people, it really needs to become a movement. So I would suggest that we not necessarily focus on a party, but we focus on a political movement of the left that is centered on socialism, but not necessarily exclusively socialist, that we create a new populist progressive party of some sort that starts as a movement that brings together parties of the left, that brings together organizations like Democratic Socialists of America that traditionally have supported the left wing of the Democratic Party. If we could bring groups like DSA and others, the Greens, for example, bring them into a coalition. And this has occurred in some places in the United States. Richmond, California, for instance, the local government there has elected numerous mayors, city council members to along a left coalition, where the people actually belong to the Green Party. They belong to some other group. They're liberal Democrats, but they campaign on a coalition platform. Our sister party, Socialist Party of Ireland, has done the same thing. The sister party of Socialist Alternative here, they actually have 3 members of the Irish Parliament running on a larger sort of left progressive ticket that includes other political movements as well. So I think that's really what we should try and focus on. And I think we can actually do that at the local level. I think we could run people for mayors, for city council, for county councils, for school boards. These are not hard things to do, as we know from our experiences in Socialist Alternative. If you have 50 committed people who are willing to put in 10 hours a week and $20 a week to a movement and really work for it, you can elect somebody to city council. You can elect somebody to a county council or a school board that represents the people's interests.
And a sort of socialisty question about that, because I agree with you completely. You'll have some people who will say, look, the attempt to use electoral politics is a dead end. It's this is a bourgeois system. You're just participating in the boss's game by playing their little bourgeois electoral games. What is your response to somebody who says that the campaign of Kshama Sawant, though a victory, doesn't mean anything because she's still just one politician in the drop of the bourgeois system?
Well, I understand their criticism, and in some ways I do sympathize with it. I understand where they're coming from, and I would agree with that criticism if that's the only thing we were trying to do. That is, if our only focus was on getting people like Kshama Sawant elected to county and city councils so we could pass higher minimum wage laws and better working conditions, and we could have better public housing, we could have more community control over police. If that was the only thing we were doing with that, I would agree with them 100%. But the thing is, for us in Socialist Alternative, we realize you can't just preach revolution on a street corner and get the masses to sign up. Leftists have been trying that in this country for 100 years. You could sell all the newspapers you want in front of a college campus entrance in a library or out in a street corner. Ain't going to get people to join the party. I've done it. It don't work. What you need to do is need to get people energized around a specific campaign that provides specific benefit to the working class. For instance, when I joined Socialist Alternative here in DC in 2015, the local group here was working on the $15 minimum wage. We were out at farmers markets, going door to door, getting people to sign the ballot initiative to get $15 minimum wage for tipped and untipped workers. Now, the city council here in DC beat us to the punch in that summer. They passed a $15 minimum wage law for untipped workers, kept it relatively low for tipped workers. The coalition that was working on this campaign decided that 3/4 of a loaf was victory. That to try and go further and try and get the signatures, which of course the Chamber of Commerce, the Restaurant Association would challenge every single signature, that this could be very expensive. These are grassroots organizations that, okay, the city council's given us a victory, 9-0, voted for a $15 minimum wage, we'll take it. And so we stopped the campaign. But I think the thing is that you use campaigns like this to energize people. You use campaigns like this to get people to join the movement. So the end goal is not $15 minimum wage or more affordable housing or community control of police. That's just one technique to get people involved. Because when people see the real benefits that parties like ours work for, when they see people like Kshama Sawant, who only takes the average worker's salary, even though the city council member in Seattle gets $120,000 a year salary, she takes $40,000 and donates the other part of her salary to local community organizations, to her own party, and that she's held accountable not only to the voters, but to her comrades in the party that, hey, we support these issues. We're campaigning and we're running you as a candidate along these political positions. You better stick to those damn positions or we're not supporting you. So the idea of she's not simply running as an individual. She's running as a representative of the working class, just like all other candidates that we support. So it's very different than simply just endorsing somebody like Bernie.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we are actually running our own candidates, and we realize that their candidacy alone will not bring the revolution. But if we could adopt in this country things like a $15 minimum wage nationally, if we could have free public and post-secondary education for anyone that wants it nationally, if we could have more affordable housing, if we could have Medicare for all, these would be profound revolutionary changes in this country. Our friends and comrades who are left of us think they just poo-poo these things. Oh, what does that mean? National health insurance. What does that mean? You know, free public higher education and $15 minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
If you do the numbers, that would be the biggest mass transfer of wealth in this country since Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s. There's going to be we're talking $1 trillion probably a year of wealth being transferred from the upper class to the working class and middle class. That in and of itself is revolutionary change, because without those type of basic things, we can never get to that socialist revolution that our friends farther left of us want. Because I don't know how they're going to get there. Are they recruiting people to storm the White House and Congress? Ain't going to work. This is in St. Petersburg in 1917. We don't have a military in tatters. We don't have a government that the leader has just resigned from, is on the run. We don't have, you know, basically anarchy in the streets of the nation's capital, as we did in St. Petersburg in 1917. So the idea that there is somehow going to be a socialist or communist revolution in this country without first mobilizing the working class around particular issues, getting them involved in politics, that's simply not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing I think that the thing that you said that is most important too is that almost like it's a very uniquely American phenomenon that you have a party whose sole responsibility is to get politicians elected. Like even in Europe, the parties are doing other things. They are in some ways a social group, and especially something like the Social Democratic Party of Germany back in the day was a whole organization that you could base your whole life on, that you could work at.
Right. They had youth organizations. They had summer camps.
Ride a bike.
They had adult education programs.
Yeah, exactly.
They had recreation programs.
Right, because it really was a representation of like a movement. It was just like that. You went to the party place. It was like the name that was on the event that you'd go with your friends. And I think that understanding that something like a party that we need in this country is a party that's not like the other two, not just in the fact that it is going to be another wing of the billionaire party, but that it's actually a genuine movement and organization, an organization that is able to provide you not only with the means to political power via a representative, but one that's recallable or one that's actually that's representing the people that genuinely representing them and not representing the interests of whoever paid their pockets, but who also is part of a larger organization that's providing material gain and that's actually doing something for you that you can say, what have these two other parties and other people ever done for me? Nothing, except for maybe give me a job that then they exploited me. What did these people do? Oh, they helped build housing. They helped, me get access to something that I needed that I couldn't get otherwise. All that, the kind of ability to link up political, electoral politics with genuine movement building is something that this country has almost never had, or hasn't had, at least since the New Deal.
I would agree completely, and that's something I think that people that aren't part of these organizations have a hard time understanding. That liberals or conservatives that basically they voted every election, they consider themselves politically active. They'll donate for a campaign. Maybe they'll go on a door knocking session on a Saturday afternoon. Might do a little phone banking, but that's really oftentimes their total involvement in politics, and that's for someone that's relatively politically active,
right? Not
just someone who votes occasionally. So so I think what a lot of folks don't realize is that being a historian and looking back at other eras of American history, I'm really viewing my membership in Socialist Alternative really is akin to the Civil Rights Movement in the sense that we consider ourselves a movement. We are a political party, but we're not just a political party. That is, you have a real sense of camaraderie with these people that you are members of the party with. I mean, we call them our brothers and sisters because they are people you've never met in person. You'll invite to stay in your house because you know what they're doing. You know that they're fighting for social justice and that they're fighting for the working class people in this country. That everyone knows we don't take any corporate money. We don't take any foundation money. We're completely self-funded as a political movement. And so the camaraderie you have in this organization is unbelievable. The idea that we all are united and we all agree on a lot of basic issues to help move this country forward. Because I think, honestly, without something akin to socialism, you can call it social democracy, socialism, communism, whatever you want to call it, but without our focus on helping those across the community, we're going to leave more and more people behind. Wealth is going to be concentrated more and more in a tiny elite upper class, and we're basically going to destroy this planet. And unless we have some form of socialism, I would say within a century, human civilization will disappear.
Yeah, it's understandable that, you know, Rosa Luxemburg is talking about socialism or barbarism, especially around the First World War. But when you're looking at what we have now in terms of the military power and potential of nuclear weapons, and added to that biological weapons and CRISPR's potential for creating all sorts of different things, and then the ecological collapse that's currently underway, and not much is being done. You have a trifecta where the socialism or barbarism sort of situation becomes even clearer, where it really is socialism or barbarism on the civilizational level, like on the earth-wide level. Like, this is, you know, Chomsky's whole way of criticizing it is talking about one party in the United States is denying the existence of the thing that may be the cause of civilizational collapse, of like organized human existence, I think is what he calls it. And the pressure that we sort of have for the sort of deciding whether or not we're going to go barbarism or socialism really stares us in the face when you have automation and the continuing inequality, the ecological stuff that's right around the corner, and the doomsday clock never being closer to midnight. It really poises the question very in a way that's really in your face, and for me gives me a bit of pause, because there's a lot of people, I think, who mean well and who are, you know, wanting to see something different in the world, but are very quick to criticize socialism because they see it as, you know, the failure of the Soviet Union and things like that. And I think communicating what we mean by socialism as is compared to the barbarism of civilizational collapse, because we haven't dealt with it, I think is a significantly important thing. And so it's part of the reason, I guess, I'm doing this podcast. But circling back a bit to Russiagate, I found this article and I posted it on Facebook that it's from Current Affairs, I think, and it's time for a little perspective on Russia, it said. And I think the article goes through the kind of arguments that I really see when it comes to Russia, in terms of like the particulars of one of the big criticisms that you'll see of being either skeptical of of the sort of Russia. I mean, right away I was skeptical because I didn't see any evidence that it was actually Russia. And as more evidence has come out, it's like, all right, maybe it is a Russian actor, and so okay, I'm willing to look at the evidence. But one of the first things that you'll hear, either from people who are in support of Trump or even from people on the farther left, is the equivalency, you know, and some more liberals maybe call that a false equivalency between Russia's meddling, as the word has become, like that's the word we use, I guess, is somehow different than America's meddling, and is more important and more worthwhile to kind of look at. And so what if, you know, I would wonder what you think about that. Is U.S. meddling in other countries, including Russia, somehow different than Russia meddling in ours? And if it is different, what makes it different? And if it isn't, why isn't it?
Right, and I did read the article that you did post on social media. Just to give the author credit, is Lyle Rubin's article called "It's a Time for a Little Perspective on Russia." It was posted July 20th in Current Affairs. He makes a lot of great points. I mean, a lot of the points he made are just sort of common knowledge among those of us on the left who are critics of American foreign policy over the last century or so. I think the main thing here is that for centuries, countries have meddled in the politics of other peoples,
especially the powerful ones.
Whether it's colonialism, going back to the British and the French and the Spanish empires of the last 4 or 5 centuries, whether it's the United States in the 20th century, of the Soviet Union in the 20th century as well. I think this is simply how nation states work, is that powerful nation states want to dominate their part of the globe, or perhaps in our case, the United States, want to dominate the whole globe. We have military bases in over 100 countries today.
Yeah.
You know, we are the only imperial power left. I mean, there are some, analogies, say to the years before the First World War in 1914, except rather than have this alliance of multiple imperial nations, we basically have one imperial nation, the United States. We have one wannabe imperial nation, the Russian Federation. I remember one quote of Vladimir Putin's. He said the most catastrophic event of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And because he felt personally devastated that Russia was no longer a main actor on the world stage, that had become a second or even third-rate military and political power. And so that is certainly one of Putin's goals, is to reestablish Russia as a major force in the world, to counter the United States and to counter China. And so I think meddling by countries specifically in elections, again, is not something unknown. The United States has been doing it, as Ruben points out in this article, for half a century. He actually quotes another political scientist that between 1946 and 2000, the United States government conducted at least 81 electoral interventions in other countries. Those are the ones that are known by evidence that we can prove. The Soviet Union did roughly half that number, again, based on evidence that's available today.
Mm-hmm.
So I think meddling in other countries' elections, whether it's openly, like in Boris Yeltsin's election in 1996, where basically the United States even bragged about how we helped Yeltsin get elected, to what the Soviets have done in Africa, in Latin America, and what we do in those parts of the world as well. So I think, all major powers throughout history intervene in the politics of less powerful nations. That's just the nature of nation states and imperialism. So it's nothing really new to me.
Is there in your, so that would be in some ways the explanation that there is no, because I've heard from even people who have studied U.S. foreign policy and things like that, that there is a significant difference between U.S. intervention and something like Russian intervention.
Well, the liberal, neoliberal explanation for that is that, of course, the United States is intervening to promote democracy.
Right.
We're intervening to fight tyranny, to prevent communist control of other nations, because all those things are necessarily bad. The real issue, though, is if you look back to American interventions, whether it's in Guatemala and Iran in the 50s, whether it's in Brazil and other countries in the 60s, just looking at the decades of my lifetime, that we pretty much intervene to protect big business, particularly American big business. We really don't intervene to promote democracy. We intervene for our own financial gain or to protect our own financial assets. It's very rare, not unknown, but very rare where the United States actually does intervene literally to promote democracy irregardless of the outcome. We're concerned about the outcome. And we want governments that are favorable to United States policy. We want governments even more so that are more favorable to American economic policy. Do we care if people have the right to vote or not in the country? No. Saudi Arabia is an ally of the United States. They're not just a friend of the United States. We have an alliance to defend Saudi Arabia if it's attacked. Saudi Arabia is a feudal monarchy that beheads women for witchcraft.
Right.
This year, not decades ago. Now they behead women for adultery, for witchcraft. They are basically an absolutist monarchy.
Yeah.
With a few modifications, a few cosmetic changes for Western consumption. To say that we promote democracy in the world and we're allied sworn by international law to protect that country and defend it, it is obscene. And you have Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives in our political system that wholeheartedly support that alliance.
Yeah, and the thing that I think is the frustrating thing about this is that the kind of idea too that there may be this notion that, well, we have to think about like the spying, we have to do those kinds of things because our interests are at stake. And I think there's an implicit understanding in most Americans' minds that when you say American interest, it means something good. That American interests mean democracy, right? And it's like, so long as that democracy is controllable, that's what the sort of American interest in democracy really means. But America is an exceptional country in its reach and the scope of its interactions in the world. I mean, there is not a country in the world that the United States has not participated in some kind of act of espionage to ensure, not to ensure, but at least to try to tip the scales in what it views as its interests. And that goes from murdering labor organizers in Colombia to orchestrating, to potentially stuffing ballots in Russia. And so I think, to me, what's so frustrating about the false equivalency thing is that the false equivalency is almost always done backwards. That like Russia's intervention, though not justified, is an attempt to do what its greatest competitor does better than it. That it doesn't get caught in the way that Russia is getting caught. And then there's probably a feeling of having been caught with your pants down a bit. I guess we should have maybe done a better job at covering this up. We didn't realize what an idiot we really were backing and what an inept team we really had there. But I think the idea that the false equivalency of talking about, there's the false equivalency and the what ifism or whataboutism. What about the United States? What about, as a way to deflect from the fact that what Russia did isn't legitimate? And so do you think there is a legitimate criticism in like the whataboutism that like that's a distraction from the actual issue of that it still is wrong to meddle in an election? And if Russia did, it was wrong.
Russia meddled in the election, and what Russia did was wrong. But we have zero moral authority to criticize them.
Yeah.
Because we do this as just a common activity in American foreign policy. This is what the State Department, the CIA, and their paid agents across the globe do. This is what they've done for a century. And it's just that Russia got exposed this time. We've occasionally gotten exposed. Thank God for the Freedom of Information Act and the Federal Records Act that requires agencies to preserve their records, at least supposedly preserve their records, so that historians can go back and look and see, yes, we did indeed intervene in Russia in 1917. We sent troops there. We tried to overthrow the infant Bolshevik Revolution. We've intervened in 50 other countries since then, either militarily directly or through CIA or its operatives, or financing political parties in Japan and other countries, backing particular political candidates like Boris Yeltsin in Russia in 1996, like we talked about earlier. So this is just the standard course of American policy. I think a lot of Americans just don't realize that. They don't realize that what Russia got caught doing, we've been doing for a century.
Mm-hmm.
And they just don't get it. When you talk about, well, it's different. They interfered in our election.
Yeah.
And the Cubans are down there, like, tell me more.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Tell me more about political interference.
Fidel Castro's rolling in his grave. Yeah, exactly. I think the one issue that's related to that too, especially when you look at something like a Cuban democracy as compared to American democracy, is the line that Lyle Rubin makes that says in the article is basically, for Russian interference to be a threat to our democracy, we'd have to have a democracy to begin with. And what that's the intro to is basically to say, look, is there a compromising of our elections by the interference of Russia in terms of the social media campaign, the disinformation, the fake news? Yeah, there really was. The the problem is that they just used something that's been done for a long time in American politics, which is straight disinformation campaigns by taking control over the media. And he talks about how, the media used to be, it's basically run by 5 different organizations. In the 80s, you still had 50, but now you have 5. And the biggest media corporation in the world right now is Facebook. And that's where I think a lot of this was really being done, Facebook and even Instagram and some of the Facebook affiliates, essentially. That the playbook that the Russians are using to provide information or disinformation is not, they didn't invent. It's something that they're just taking hold of what's already existed in the United States and doing it to a greater degree and maybe even a little bit better. And so the comparison, I guess, is the question I would have for you I had a conversation with a coworker of mine who said it's different. We could say all day long that our democracy is compromised by big interests and people who buy elections and all that kind of stuff. But it's different when someone else comes in and screws with your election. So I'm wondering, do you think there's a genuine difference between those two things? And if there is, what is it? And if there is not, why isn't there a difference between those two things?
Well, it's really like the group of bullies on your block who beat up every kid in the neighborhood regularly get really pissed off when some bullies from a couple blocks over come over to their block and start beating up those kids. Who's like those people are our people to fuck over. You don't fuck over our people because that's our job is to beat them up. You go back over in your own neighborhood and beat those people up. So I really just have a hard time grasping, the outrage over Russia's meddling. Again, obviously I'm not pro-Russian. I'm certainly very much against Putin and his regime. I'm very much against their meddling in our election or any other elections. It's just the fact that we do the same thing all the time. We have no moral authority to criticize that as a country. Should we try and stop it? Should we put sanctions against Russia? Should we do other things? Of course we could. And we probably should. But I think to be outraged about it is just ridiculous. And I think we need to really look at American foreign policy and say, okay, now Americans are realizing what it means to have your political system screwed by some other country. Americans finally are realizing how every person in Latin America has felt the last 80 fucking years, how everybody in Europe and Africa, in most nations around the world have felt by American domination and American imperialism and basically us controlling their countries. Mm-hmm. We're starting to feel just a tiny bit of that. And I think Americans need to work through that feeling and think, okay, yeah, we're pissed off because the Russians interfered in our elections and we've been doing the same thing. So maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we shouldn't interfere in other countries' elections. Maybe we need to pull back our military. Maybe we don't need military bases in 100 countries around the world. Maybe we don't need, military and political control over the entire globe. Maybe we can let people evolve their own political and social systems. They might be different than ours. Maybe sometimes we don't like them, but that's those people's choice. Mm. And, are we going to stop American intervention? Are we going to stop other countries from intervening? No. But if we could do anything, we could say that there has to be moral authority. There is no moral authority in the United States to intervene someplace. If our neighbor, if Canada was being infiltrated by some fascist government and that was sending troops, that was sending money to militarily overthrow the Canadian government, should we help them? Of course. Mm-hmm. But that's a far different, more outward, overt type of assisting a people to defend their sovereignty, to defend their nationhood, as opposed to the surreptitious, behind closed doors attempts to influence elections or overthrow governments. Those are two different things. And I think we need to recognize that one is just morally reprehensible, even if we're doing it. Mm. The other one is much more morally defensible, and we need to focus more on those more limited situations. And we really need to stop interfering in other countries' politics, because we finally realize we don't like it.
You get a bit of taste of your own medicine, you realize how bad it really is when you're giving it to other people. That it brings me to another question that I think was actually something that was a good question from a rather astute friend of mine. He said, one of the things that can be easy to do about American foreign policy, particularly, is to criticize it. That it's pretty easy to say, like, that was fucked up and that was fucked up and you shouldn't have done that, and like you really screwed that up, and even if you had the right intentions, you screwed up how you did it, and that can be. I mean, I remember hearing in law school even that, like, those are pretty trite. All the criticisms of America are easy to do. What we want is something a little more interesting, right? But so okay. And one of the things that he said is the issue is what you hear on the left a lot of times is criticism of American foreign policy. But what you don't hear is an articulation of what a left foreign policy would really look like. And so somebody who has studied both the history of U.S. foreign policy but understands a bit about the international system, what do you think a left foreign policy looks like? Let's say that Bernie Sanders gets elected and taps you and a team to craft the foreign policy. What do you think it looks like?
Oh my God. Well, Bernie, while I did, personally support Bernie during the 2016 election, his foreign policy would probably not be very different than the current neoliberal foreign policy, unfortunately. Bernie has a lot of good traits. He also has some bad traits as a social democrat. But to answer your question about what would or should a socialist foreign policy look like, I think first of all, foreign policy is not simply military alliances. Foreign policy is not negotiation at the government level between states. It's not alliances. It's also helping people. I mean, to me, my idea of a socialist foreign policy would be, first of all, to realize that the United States and other imperialist nations owe a real debt to the less developed nations of the world. The so-called less developed nations of the world, such as Central and South America, Africa, large parts of Asia, are less developed and less poor because they have been raped by Western imperialist states for several centuries. Their wealth, their people have been stolen from their land. So I think the bedrock of any socialist foreign policy of this country needs to be based on some idea of reparations, or some idea that we owe the rest of the world something for what our forefathers have done to them. And it would also have great positive benefits for this country. So not advocating a policy of large development projects, educational projects, a new Peace Corps, maybe perhaps emulating what the Cubans do, and that is, for those listeners who aren't aware, Cuba is very well known around the world, especially in Africa, for their training of physicians and nurses and people in other medical fields, and simply sending people there, staffing hospitals, clinics, to simply help people combat malaria, combat other diseases, deliver babies, conduct surgeries, and simply help people with no idea of recompense or gain, but simply providing material assistance to those folks that need it. So that is a bedrock of American foreign policy, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in economic development projects, whether it's in education. And we do some of that. We do give some lip service to that. We have a Peace Corps. We have other activities run by the State Department, run by other organizations that will do those things. But we simply probably need to increase these 100-fold. These needs to be the basis of American foreign policy. We need to pull back our military bases. We need to downsize the military. We need to actively support democratic movements in less democratic countries and simply let those play out. That is, again, I said democratic movements, not political parties. The United States should not be involved in providing money or technology or assistance to political parties and countries in any country in the world. We should, however, provide things that will help people take control of their own countries. Things like education, things like technology, building libraries. Libraries are one of the most important civic institutions that many Americans take for granted, because even if you grew up in a small town, we have a pretty functional library.
Yep.
You can get a lot of journals and magazines.
Yep.
If your little small town library doesn't have it, you can get interlibrary loan from another library in a neighboring county or in the next big city. And obviously, if you grew up in a medium or larger size city, huge library, any kind of resources you need, you can learn just about anything you want.
Yep.
Simply going to the library on a Saturday afternoon. People in developing nations don't have that luxury. That is, in many countries in Africa and Asia, the concept of every town having a public library really doesn't exist to the extent it does here. I've lived in Greece and I've visited a number of other countries, that are developed countries that have nowhere near the developed public library system that we have.
Yeah.
So things like that, people don't think, well, gee, Michael, what do libraries have to do with American foreign policy? But that to me is the key to promote democracy. If we really believe in a foreign policy that promotes democracy and social justice, we don't need to take sides in individual political campaigns within countries. We need to support, institutions that provide education and knowledge and a better way of life for people, and let them figure out their own politics locally.
I was going to say, because the one question on that was going to be, because I agree in principle. I'm glad that you mentioned Cuba, because when my friend had asked me about that, I really did use Cuba as the model of a foreign policy, that you engage in foreign policy when you're mostly going to help. And if you're going to engage with your military, it's going to be to throw off the yoke of someone who's trying to sustain the old system. And I think that just is a two-pillared kind of idea. Go where you can help, and help when you go. And go, if you're going to go with guns, go to prevent worse things from happening, Yeah,
and I would make a caveat that I do not support the current political system in Cuba. 50 years of anybody, even if Fidel Castro in power, is not a good thing. So while I certainly would support the Cuban Revolution and what that revolution has done to improve the living standards of people since 1959 in Cuba, I think the government itself became very Stalinist, very much of a personalist political system based around the leader, which, as you and I know in Socialist Alternative, is a real negative, because in our organization, we do not have individual leaders. We don't have a party chairperson. We don't have a branch chairperson. We work by committees. We work by collective leadership. Yeah. And I think that is really the best way to create a socialist state, or to have any other kind of participatory democracy. That is, you're not choosing a leader. My big criticism of the Bernie campaign and the people that supported Bernie is they put too much hope on him as an individual. And they were so devastated when Bernie lost. Yeah. Because even Bernie himself said, this is not about me, this is about us. And I think people just didn't buy that. For all his faults, I think Bernie, like I said in my little essay on Facebook, turned on light bulbs above millions of people's heads about the ideas of socialism and social democracy. They're not evil Russian red things. Yeah. They're things that have a history in this country. They're things that Republicans and Democrats have supported for a century and a half, particular policies like free public K-12 education, which is one of the pillars of the Communist Manifesto that Marx and Engels wrote in 1848. So those ideas have been around, have been supported in our country for a long time. And I think what people need to focus on is building movements. Again, getting back to that idea that we can't focus on an individual like Bernie Sanders or even our own Shama Sawant in Seattle. We have to focus on building a movement. And you do that by instituting political campaigns around issues that affect regular working people, such as a $15 minimum wage, Medicare for all, public, health insurance for all, free public and post-secondary higher education. We need that in this country to build the socialist future that we want.
And the sort of second thing that I had the idea of having a democracy, going back to this sort of Russia thing too, having a democracy to begin with that you can say was actually infiltrated or interfered with. Really, the point of what he was saying is that we have a huge corporate takeover of our political system. And I think one of the things that there's a sort of misnomer about that I think you'd really be able to articulate the right answer to, which is that, look, the problem is that there's just too much money in our politics, and that if we got rid of Citizens United, then the system would correct itself, because Citizens United is the problem. And that it's not that corporations are people and that they can give money or anything like that. It's not that. That's okay. It's just the unlimited amounts and the sort of shady way that it can be done with political action committees and stuff. What is the sort of response to that explains more of corporate influence, whether it's allowed to be unfettered like through Citizens United or what it was like before that?
Well, I think Americans, those of a liberal or left persuasion, now realize that there is this corporate domination of American politics, and that there's this unfettered, unlimited amounts of money since Citizens United flowing into politics. However, I pause when I hear that thing, the corporate takeover of American politics. Because I don't think there was a period, whether it was with Citizens United 5 or 10 years ago or 20 years ago or some event, that all of a sudden corporations took over American politics. The wealthy have always controlled American politics. If you go back to the Constitutional Convention, if you go back to the fact that, you're talking a constitution written mostly by wealthy, upper middle class white men who protected the interests of upper middle class and wealthy white men. That our system has always been based on protecting that class. That is, yes, we have had some form of democratic elections since the early 19th century, with the abolition of property tests or other literacy tests for white voters. So we pretty much since the 1830s, 1840s, most white men over 21 could vote. Practically all white men over 21 could vote in this country. Does that make our country a democracy? The thing is, at the local level, in many cases, I think that there was and still is very democratic people, elected people who are regular folks who are trying to do good in their community. But I think even going back to the late 18th century and into the 19th century, the wealthy class, whether it was the planter class in the South, whether it was the growing industrial class, the railroad barons in the North, we've always had a oligarchic or corporate control of the political system. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but that control has always been there. It's just much more in our face now since Citizens United, or even going back, say, the last 10, 20 years, 30 years, the people's awareness of money in politics, simply because it's more open and more brazen, but it's always been there. And I think we need to really move away from that system by getting all money out of politics. We need publicly financed elections. We need elections, this is my personal view, not necessarily Socialist Alternative. We need elections where no candidate can take any campaign contributions, where the whole concept of campaign contributions becomes synonymous with bribery,
right?
Which in many cases it is
today.
What
it is, yeah.
When it's large contributions. But the idea that we should have public elections that are financed by the public, where basically people can learn about the positions of the various candidates. You would have publicly sponsored debates. You could have advertisement time, perhaps, given to candidates who meet a certain threshold, who get a certain number of signatures. That would not be an outrageous number for a person to get with the help of 20, 30, 40 people. You would not require a large amount of money to do that. I think if we could start doing that, particularly at the local level, we could have really a rebirth of democracy in this country. I think electing people like Shama Swant in our party, electing people for the Green Party, many of our listeners might not know that the Greens have over 150 candidates that have successfully, that now currently successfully hold office at the city, the county, and the state level.
I didn't know that.
It's 163 as of 2018.
That's pretty good.
It's a large number, and we're not simply just talking about a couple school board members or council members. We're talking mayors of cities. We're talking county executives. We're talking city council members across the country. And so I think there is an appetite for independent politics out there that's outside of the two-party system. I just think that many organizations trying to bring that about have just not been very successful for many reasons. I think looking at the Green Party, I'm not an expert on the history of the Green Party, but I think one of their concerns perhaps is that they put too much emphasis on national politics and not quite enough on local. And they do have a lot of local people elected, but I think if they push that even more strongly, this is just some, unasked for advice by someone who's a fan of the Green Party. They've been very successful the last few decades, but I think they have the potential to do much more. And they could certainly be a part of that movement that we've been talking about, this political movement of the left and progressive folks that really realize we need to do away with this two-party system. And we honestly don't care which one of the two parties drops. We prefer if both did. But we really want to have a party that represents the people, that elects workers that are not going to just enrich themselves from their political activities, but are going to work for the average person in this country.
Well said on that one. The one thing that I sort of thought about while you were talking, and it's related to the idea, but I think to understand part of the dynamic between the United States and Russia, sort of going back to the significant amount of competition that's happened. You did kind of mention it, but I wonder. I did one episode where I just talked about what I think about 20th century socialism, mostly meaning the USSR and China in particular. And I talked to a guy who Daniel, who was a Marxist-Leninist, and so very much in favor of many of the actions of the Soviet Union and putting it into a perspective where it becomes more understandable than I think a lot of us are willing to sort of stomach. I wonder about what you think about the sort of history of Russia in the 20th century and how it kind of relates to the dynamic between the United States and Russia, because the experience between the United States and Russia, they're invariably intertwined, especially in the second half of the 20th century. But I wonder that there's a lot of, for lack of a better term, bourgeois explanations and ways of looking at the dynamic between the U.S. and how that relates to Russia's experience in the 20th century. But I'm wondering to hear a more Marxist kind of perspective on that interaction and how that all shook out at the end.
If you look at the relationships between Russia and the United States over history, you realize that Russia and the United States were really, in the 19th century, were geographically very far apart, didn't have a lot of contact with each other. Really, the first interaction at a national level between these two nations was the acquisition of Alaska from Russia in 1867, the purchase of Alaska, even despite the fact that there's tens of thousands of indigenous people living there who didn't even know the transaction was taking place. We acquired Alaska for $7.2 million from
all people included.
All people included, and yes, so that's really our first contact. And while the United States and Russia did have diplomatic relations, they were neither friendly nor allied. Not a lot of trade. There simply was not a lot of contact compared to our relations, say, with Britain, with France, with Italy, Spain, other European countries, even Japan. Not very close relations. I mean, I think most Russians tend to have a long memory, would really think about American relations when the Bolshevik Revolution occurred in 1917, and in 1918, the United States, along with a dozen other countries, invaded Russia to put down that revolt, which explicitly challenged the capitalist order around the world, not just in Russia. And so when Americans wonder why Russia has such adversarial views toward us, why there's a distinct anti-Americanism within Russia. Just imagine in our country in 1917, if our government was in collapse and a populist movement rose up to give power to the people, and Russia had sent 10,000 troops and tens of millions of dollars to reinstall an absolutist monarchy or some kind of authoritarian government in our country that tried to actively stamp out that populist revolution. We would be pretty aghast. We would be, oh my God, these evil bastards that come into our country when we're down on our luck and we're fighting a civil war, and they support the authoritarian, totalitarian regime.
Yeah, Russians are the worst.
Yeah, Russians are the worst. Yeah. And so we wonder why there's anti-Americanism around the world, but particularly in Russia. Russians have long memories. This was 1917. To Russians, it's yesterday. And to them, they look at America as an adversary because we invaded their country at the birth of their current political system, looking at Russia through the 20th century.
At a liberation moment, at a moment where they're feeling liberated from absolute
through the 20s and 30s, again, Russia and the United States were not interacting in a major way compared to their interactions with their neighbors and other countries. But when you look at the results of the Second World War, when Europe, Japan, East Asia are completely devastated, physically and economically and politically by the Second World War, and you really have the United States practically untouched. You have Russia losing 20 million people in the war, massive devastation of its western areas, but still coming out much, much stronger militarily and politically and even economically than it entered the war. So at the end of World War II in 1945, you have two world powers. And Russians, again, have memories. They realize the United States is an adversary. We might have handshakes and smiles when we're signing documents at Potsdam or other things, but we're still their adversaries. This is the Russians. They're thinking, the Americans might want to play nice with us, but when they talk about extending democracy, supporting democracy around the world, they mean extending American influence.
Yep.
And so, of course, the Russians want to do the same because they do not want a repeat of what happened to them in the First and Second World Wars. They don't want a devastating invasion which in the First World War overthrew their government or led to the overthrow of the government and the rise of the Bolshevik Revolution. And in the Second World War almost led to the overthrow of their government. So the Russians are very, very defensive about their territory and about their rights as a power, which our country has not really experienced. We've never had that devastating loss in our country. Unless you go back to the Civil War, as far as just number of people killed, massive,
and it wasn't an invasion,
and it was an internal
conflict. Last time the place
conflict.
was invaded, it was by white people.
Right. The last time the United States was invaded and there was damage done was in 1812 when the British burned the White House, among other things. So we don't have that memory. But everybody in Russia today, I have friends who are in this country who are from Russia originally, and everybody knows about their father, their grandfathers, history in the Great Patriotic War, what the Russians call the Second World War, or even going back to the Bolshevik Revolution. Everybody remembers that. They honor that. I mean, you just,
in Russia, it's everywhere. It's you can't go, literally on like corners, just like, hey, just to let you know, like we beat them. Like we fought that war. Like we were invaded and we beat them. Right. And then, and then everything after that.
So I think that's really the crux of American foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia and the United States that most Americans don't get. Is that we intervened in their country to overthrow their nascent sort of, progressive Bolshevik system that was overthrowing Tsardom. And we don't realize that we invaded them. We sent troops to invade the country and overthrow the government. And we wonder why they don't like us. And you trace everything back to that. Russian foreign policy over the next century then looks a little more logical. What was Stalinism trying to gain control over the whole world? Sure. Was that a good thing? No. But many of the things that Stalin and his successors did from a Russian point of view were logical steps.
Right.
They didn't want to be invaded again. They didn't want a third world war that would lead to Russian defeat. They were willing to risk a third world war to prevent Russia from being defeated as it was almost in the First and Second World Wars.
Yeah, and I think and what you have then too is that you have a period of time where Russia gets nuclear parity, which I think was a big deal and a fact of pride, and then you have its winning the space race up till the moon, which was like a source of like saying, all right, the means of competition internationally include our ability to express power, our technological advancements, and the relative welfare of our people. And if you look at how Russia was in 1917 compared to how it was in 1959, it's unbelievably different. And I mean, the United States is too, in some significant ways. I wouldn't want to discount that. But the difference between the Russian situation in 1917 and the Russian situation in 1959 is orders of magnitude different. And then the thing I think is important too is that, especially to understand something like Putin's perspective and the St. Petersburg people that are around Putin, which is kind of his power base, is experience of the end of the Soviet Union, because the United States, there's this sort of myth about how the Soviet Union fell, which was that it was this, on par power that couldn't compete with Ronald Reagan's ability and balls to make more nuclear weapons and to tell Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall, and he did. And so to me, what the important thing to realize about the whole way that went down. I mean, I was in the political museum, the Museum of Political History in St. Petersburg in March of this year. And that's where Lenin literally gave the April thesis. It's where the Bolsheviks were centered. It was a pretty cool museum. But when they were talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union, nobody had any idea. I mean, even up to the week or so before, if you ask the average Russian, do you think in 2 weeks the Soviet Union will basically not be around anymore? They tell you were fucking crazy. The system's here to stay. It's like we feel about our system. And but at the same time, what they didn't realize was the amount of U.S. meddling and participation in the disintegration of essentially sort of order in that system, such that it collapsed. And when it did collapse, what you had was shock therapy. So it just this sort of introduction of market economies and the ability for certain actors who would become the oligarchs to take control of the economy, and 20 fucking years of economic hardships. So the idea that Russian, not only is Russian memory long, it need not be, because the tragedy of the 20th century, according to Vladimir Putin, though interestingly not being something like the Holocaust, being the breakup of the Soviet Union, makes a little more sense when you realize that what the breakup of the Soviet Union caused was certainly the collapse of Russia, which essentially was the Soviet Union, as a world power, but also 20 years of economic woe that only really did get righted by the increase in oil prices that then got dropped, and Russia's sort of economic power base is lost essentially by American intervention, and also NATO moving from Germany, where it was supposed to end, to now Lithuania. It makes a Russian perspective at least a little more understandable.
Of course, because what they experienced is what we have not experienced yet.
Yeah.
And that is the collapse of the Russian Empire. Because the Soviet Union was 15 republics, Russia being one of them. And so places like Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and the Warsaw Pact countries that were never part of the Soviet Union per se, but were really under their domination, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the other parts of Eastern Europe, were no longer part of that Russian Empire. So what Russia experienced is, a collapse of their worldview. The idea that they, while maybe not competitive against the United States in many areas, had their own regional influence.
Mm-hmm.
And so Russia now is a much smaller place than it once was. And when you think about, Russia before the Soviet Union, it was a vast empire and included a lot of the area around the Black Sea, a lot of parts of East Asia, parts of what's now China. So to people like Putin, when they say the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest disaster of the 20th century, what they're talking about is like Russia no longer has an empire. We're just a country. And we're pretty much a relatively not
Third
well
rate,
off
yeah.
with a second-rate army and a third-rate navy and maybe a 2.5-rate Air Force.
Yeah.
And so we're no longer that major power, that myth that we have perpetuated, which maybe at some point had lost its truth before the actual physical collapse. But yeah, that's an issue, and that's what fuels, I think, the support for Putin. It fuels Russian nationalism. That type of nationalistic feeling, of course, is what is fueling Trump and his regime in this country. And I think as socialists, that's one of the things we really have to fight against, because this idea of rampant nationalism leads to racism and xenophobia and leads to war and famine and economic collapse. And what our foreign policy needs to do is promote the exact opposite of that. We need to support cooperation. We need to support demilitarization, denuclearization. We need to support education and healthcare around the world, not arming every country that will take our weapons.
So the one last question about sort of Russia, and then I have one question about another country related to Putin, and then so if you look at something like Russia's most recent expressions of its foreign policy objectives, you see two things mostly: the Crimea, which is part of its objective of maintaining what it can have of its former imperial influence, and then Syria, a sort of old ally that we are willing to want. Either, depending on, I'm curious how you look at it, either it's a great place to have some bases in the Med, and we have a Navy base that we can use there, which is really nice to have our Mediterranean fleet to be able to get into a Syrian port if it needs to. Or that this is an old ally that we said that a long time ago that we would help, and we never said we won't help them, so we're helping them fight against terrorists who we've also dealt with in places like Chechnya that, we also militarily invaded. So what do you think about Russia's, part of the criticism of Russia is its quote-unquote annexation of Crimea from Ukraine. And I wonder, how you see the Russian-Ukrainian dynamic vis-a-vis Crimea and Russia's goals and perspective in Syria.
Right. I mean, my opinion is a little colored by my ethnicity, and that Melinchok is really probably originally Melnichek before Ellis Island, which is Little Miller. Melnik is Miller in Russian and in Bulgarian and Slavic languages. So it's a very common name in Eastern Europe, Melnik, which, as I said, means Miller. And so as someone who grew up in a Ukrainian-American household, with my grandparents on my father's side speaking Ukrainian to my father, and having some feeling of Ukrainian nationalism, I'm just really saddened by the political state of Ukraine. Because Ukraine is really dominated by right-wing nationalist political parties, for the most part, with right-wing militias and a lot of racial hatred.
No communist party.
And really, no communist party that of any sort. And really, the problem is a lot of these words are really backed up by nothing, in the sense that the reason why Russia was able to take over Crimea was because the Ukrainian military is pretty much of a joke. I mean, at one point, I think I read during that invasion that Ukraine had 6 active first-rate infantry battalions. So we're talking maybe 5,000 active troops that could be on the ground and actually combat that Russian invasion. For a country, we're talking a country, population-wise, the size of Italy or France almost. 50, 60, 70 million people.
Geographically much bigger.
Geographically much larger than any European country. To have such a weak and poorly maintained military, the Russians see that as easy pickings. I mean, to them, seizing Crimea, or perhaps even in some future date seizing eastern Ukraine, which they view as part of Russia. The political things in Chechnya and other regions where the local folks are not ethnically Russian but are dominated by the Russian political system. Russia sees that as maintaining their empire. They lost so much of it with the collapse of the Soviet Union. They want to try and claw a little bit of it back. That they would love to annex Ukraine. That probably wouldn't fly in Ukraine, but they might grab little pieces of it, like Crimea and the eastern provinces. I think that there's not much we can do about it. There's not much the United States other than threaten war against Putin to combat this aggressiveness in foreign policy, because we basically do the same thing in our own backyard. We've invaded other countries in the Caribbean and in Central and South America. We sort of maintain our own, our own control over our region of the world. For us to expect Russia not to do that, I'm not defending it. I'm just saying, just as a rational thought process, it would be irrational for us not to expect Russia to do that.
The game theory of it makes
and I think the idea that It would be great if there was a strong democratic Ukraine with a strong functional military that the United States could support to defend themselves against foreign intervention, foreign invasion. But unfortunately, there is not. There is not much we can do. There are no progressive forces that we can really support there. So it's sort of a lose-lose proposition for the United States.
Do you buy the Donetsk People's Republic? Like the sort of claim of the people in positions of political power in a place like, in Eastern Ukraine, who are saying that it's a legitimate People's Republic who has seceded on its own accord and the elections are, verifiable? Or do you think it is a campaign by the Russians to?
It's some of both. I think there are people in that movement who genuinely believe in that movement and that they are seceding from what they view as a foreign power in Kiev.
There are a lot of Russians in,
but there are a lot of Russians all through Crimea, all through Ukraine. There are lots of Russians all over the former Soviet Union.
That's true.
And I think for a lot of those folks, it is legitimate. Is it also simply a tool, a vehicle for Russian foreign policy to gain more territory back? Yeah, of course. Yeah. It's both.
What about Syria?
I think the thing with Syria is Russia had strong military relations with many countries in the heyday of the Soviet Union, 1950s, 60s, 70s, economic development projects, military aid, military advisors to Egypt, to Syria, to numerous countries in the Middle East, in Africa, even to a lesser extent in Asia. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, all that largesse just dried up. There simply was no money. There wasn't the funds to just provide that kind of aid anymore. So I think the idea of Putin is to try and reestablish some of that. While Assad's not the only person, him and his father, who the Russian government made promises to back in the heyday of the Soviet Union, because of its proximity to the Soviet Union, because, as you alluded to earlier, the idea that perhaps there would be a naval base for Russia in the outcome, that it would finally have access to the Mediterranean unfettered, that it would be fantastic for Russian prestige to back up one of its old former allies. That I think Putin is looking this as an opportunity. It's relatively low risk in the sense that if it doesn't work out, we might lose some airplanes, we might lose some pilots, we might lose a few personnel, we might be out a couple $100 million. But the positives are if we establish a pro-Russian Assad regime that is unfettered by any type of terrorist or rebel attacks within the country, if they can reestablish his authority over the country and grant Russia a naval base, grant Russia some air bases, perhaps some other territorial concessions as an ally, like we ask all of our allied countries and even some countries that aren't allies, we need that military base, we need that airfield.
Right.
And so I think that would be a huge win for Russia to have a Mediterranean, just the idea of a Mediterranean fleet.
Right.
What the Tsars dreamed of.
Right, exactly.
To have a Mediterranean fleet, even if it's a couple beat up cruisers and destroyers, and an air base there with 20 jet planes and a couple helicopters.
Russian Mediterranean fleet.
It's the prestige of that, how that would be just the political value domestically for Putin and his allies and successors would be tremendous.
Yeah.
Not to mention the actual real military and economic value that would have for Russia. So I think for Russia, it's a
no-brainer.
It's a very favorable gamble.
Yeah.
To do that, I think there's not a lot of downside.
So the one place that is a bit of a switching gears, but I think it relates to foreign policy in the Trump era, is and sort of socialisty kind of stuff is the North Korea question. So, there was a lot of, I remember I was in Denver, Colorado over 420 when I saw the news that there was going to be that Kim Jong-un had agreed to have a summit, right? And I thought maybe this is like the smoke, maybe it's I couldn't fucking believe it. I was like, God damn it. Is Donald Trump going to get a Nobel Peace Prize for denuclearizing Korea? And, because that was just like the last thing I want to do is inflate the guy's ego and a Nobel Peace Prize so that he can compete with Obama's ill-gotten Nobel Peace Prize. Just the optics of that seemed terrible, but there seemed to be quite a lot of things to be, cautiously optimistic about in terms of the first meeting of a sitting American president with a North Korean leader, and the possibility for denuclearization, which would definitely calm the sort of situation in certainly the Korean Peninsula, but even in Asia, sort of Northern Asia in particular, including China. So, what was sort of your thinking about that when that started, and now that we've kind of seen a number of reasons to be skeptical of the sort of outcome? What do you sort of think ultimately?
Well, I think people like Trump and like the North Korean leader, Putin, these people that have an authoritarian mindset, that if people just listen to me, the world would be good, that people need to follow my orders, they tend to be attracted to each other. That is, a person like Putin, while him and obviously him and his intelligence agency realize that Trump is just an idiot in many ways, that he's a spoiled rich kid who just happened to fall into all the success he's had, and his only really claim to fame is simply a television reality show.
You're fired.
But I think there is still that strong attraction among the strong man type of leader for their peers. And I think that because they think they themselves control reality, that Trump can simply go there and make things happen. Or that Putin himself, I'm sure, believes that he himself can make things happen. That's why he keeps getting himself elected to either president or prime minister, whichever comes up in the rotation, because he doesn't really trust his subordinates. He trusts himself only to make the right decision always. And I think that they have a disdain for their advisors sometimes. They have disdain for outside influences. They have their little close circle.
They're all stable geniuses.
They're all stable geniuses. So the way they operate, when you think about how they operate politically, they have their enforcers. They have their close political circle. They have the close group of advisors. They pretty much tune out everything else. It's very different than the neoliberal mindset, where you want a brain trust. You call on people from universities. You bring in people for strategy sessions to look at the different options and the pluses and minuses. They have a mindset. They know what's right, always. And they want people around that will nod their head, also give them good advice, but basically agree with them most of the time. And so what do I make of Trump going to North Korea and negotiating this agreement? It is so hard to figure out. I mean, it's really like flipping a coin. Will the North Koreans live up to it? Who knows? Their track record is not that great about living up to agreements with the West. Will they perhaps consider it a different type of agreement because they're negotiating with a fellow, quote, strongman, another authoritarian who understands how the world works, unlike those neoliberals and socialists and others. So who knows? I mean, who really knows what will come of it? I'm not that optimistic. I think that the North Koreans perhaps may be playing Trump and playing the United States. They might legitimately think, hey, Trump is maybe the best deal we've been able to get in the last 60 or 70 years. Maybe he actually, if he starts pulling American troops out of South Korea, he's already agreed to stop the annual military exercises. If he starts pulling back American troops from South Korea, hey,
sounds good.
That's
to me.
a great victory for us.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll get on board with this guy. And North Koreans, of course, have a long memory because while many people are favorable to the American intervention in Korea in the early 1950s, we do need to remember that the United States Air Force really killed about 20% of the entire North Korean population in its massive bombing campaign, which most Americans have no idea even took place. When they think about American massive bombing campaigns, they're thinking about, Europe in World War II. The B-17s and B-24s flying over Germany, destroying the cities and factories, or Japan, thinking Hiroshima and Nagasaki, firebombing of Tokyo. They don't think that the greatest, by percent of population, bombing campaign against any country in the history of the world was the American Air Force campaign against North Korea in the early 1950s. Koreans remember that because every single person in North Korea has an uncle, aunt, grandfather, grandmother who was killed in that bombing campaign. So their fears are not illegitimate. Their government may be illegitimate, but the aspirations and fears of North Koreans are not illegitimate. And I think, who knows? I mean, who knows what will come of this? I don't.
So to kind of pull it all together and bring it back home a bit, I think what you mentioned was the understanding of that Trump has with other authoritarian leaders or authoritarian minded leaders, and I think a lot of times some of those of us who may find themselves in the more radical aspects of the left will see Trump as, or maybe use the language of fascism to describe Trump. And what you do see is a rise of far right and fascistic kind of tendencies, even in Germany, but definitely in Greece and in France and even in Britain, definitely in Russia. So we have an event in August here of all far right people who I think who felt emboldened by Trump's victory and things like that. So what do you think about the use of fascist to sort of describe Donald Trump and the Donald Trump rise, and also what's necessary for the left to be able to genuinely counteract the rise of far right and white supremacist kind of elements in our own society?
Well, my view, looking at the history of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, is that there were very unique political movements within those countries, and really anything that comes after that, you'd really have to refer to as like neo-fascist or neo-Nazi. And I know that's like it's maybe splitting hairs on the definitions, but do I believe that Trump is a neo-Nazi or a neo-fascist or plain out Nazi or fascist? I don't think so. I think he has
tendencies.
He has tendencies. Yeah, I think he has tendencies toward those strategies and tactics of fascists and Nazi organizations. He does not necessarily have negative viewpoints toward them. He may have some negative viewpoints, but he probably has some positive viewpoints toward them. Their support for a strong leader, their support for a strong military, their support for white supremacy. I think it's certainly evident that Trump is a racist and Trump is a xenophobe. Trump is homophobic and Trump is misogynist. I think just based on his history, those are pretty true statements. It's hard to argue with.
He at least plays one on TV.
Right. And I think that's his reality. And so because those movements emulate him in those areas, and they also sort of have traditionally favored the strong leader, the one-party state, I think Trump would be happy as president of a fascist USA. Whether he has a grasp of what Nazism is or fascism is, I don't think he does. Do I object to people calling his regime, his administration, a Nazi regime or neo-Nazi regime? I don't have a strong objection to it. It's not really accurate, but I'm not going to stop anybody from chanting "No Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA," because it has some aspects of fascism involved in it.
The sentiment it's giving,
right. This idea of supporting corporate America, of corporatism, of being anti-union, being, like, as I said, xenophobic and racist and misogynist. These are all part of that thing. Blaming other ethnicities for our country's problems.
The Muslim ban,
the Muslim ban, these remarks about Mexicans. So Trump has very strong fascist tendencies, or tendencies that align with fascism. But I personally would not call him a fascist or a Nazi, but I have no problem with people that do.
And what about what is necessary for those of us on the left to counteract the rise of right-wing elements, both in the world but also definitely at home?
I think we have to. I think the best way to fight the rise of fascism, white nationalism, Nazism, all these movements of the far right, is to remember the idea that we cannot tolerate intolerance. We talk about being a tolerant society, of everyone has the right to speak their mind, that why should we as a group, Socialist Alternative, go out on August 12th and try and shut down this far-right white nationalist rally that's going to occur in Washington, D.C.? And I think we have to remember that basically, if we tolerate intolerance, if we allow groups to speak who call for the extermination of particular races or religions, who call for the closeting at best of gay people, who call for women to go back into the kitchen in church and mind their own business, we were allowing people to speak who basically are attacking the rights of our fellow human beings, who deny their humanity in many ways. And so I think there has to be a limit of what we will tolerate. That is, if we had a person on a street corner calling for the gassing of all the Jews in this country, or for the extermination of all black and brown people, or let's all send those Negroes back to Africa, which they often don't use that N-word.
Right.
And there was actually an incident in the news a couple of weeks ago of somebody on a street corner with a sign saying that, let's send all those N-word folks back to Africa.
Wow.
To me, that crosses a line. To me, I don't think you have the right to say that. I don't think you have the right to say, let's exterminate the Jews. Let's sterilize all black and brown people so they don't have any kids, and we have a reemergence of a white world, as Richard Spencer and his organization have called for. I think those things are intolerable. We should have laws against them, as a number of European countries do. That is classifying that as hate speech, classifying that as calling for the extermination or denial of rights to groups of people needs to be a crime. Now, free speech advocates might say, well, what are you doing, Michael? You're not allowing the free exchange of ideas. You can't have free exchanges of ideas among people who are exterminated.
Yeah.
There wasn't much of a free exchange of ideas among European Jews in 1945 because they were all gassed and murdered by the Nazi regime and their allies across Europe. So when groups start calling for, the annihilation of particular races or ethnicities or genders or sexual orientations, or calling for violence across those groups, they've crossed the line, in my opinion. They do not have a right to spread that kind of hatred. I personally, not speaking for my party, but personally, I have no problem with people violently opposing that type of speech. My father and all my uncles fought in the Second World War. They killed Nazis in the 1940s. I have personally no problem with killing Nazis in 2018, whether they're in this country or in other places, because we know what that type of movement does. We know the outcome of that rise to power of that nationalist, white supremacist Nazi right. And I think we have to prevent it before it gets to any stage where it can cause that type of damage that it did in Europe in the 1940s, for example.
That is one of the more cogent versions of that argument I've heard. So I honestly appreciate that. The last little thing, just to wrap up, because I think makes sense to do it there, would just be one of the things that I'm always curious about with people, definitely on the left, would be where they're finding their information, their news, places that maybe people aren't finding, such as a different podcast or a news outlet or something like that that's well worth checking out. And then where can people find, what you're doing so that they can see what you're spreading? Right. So if folks are interested in finding out what Socialist Alternative is doing, nationally, we have a website, socialistalternative.org. The DC branch here, of which I am a member. We are on Facebook. We have a site called Socialist Alternative DC. Check us out. Follow us. We try to provide a good bit of information about what's going on in progressive politics in the nation's capital and also nationally. I think that as far as personally where I get a lot of my news, I really have a very diverse set of friends excuse me, around the world, not just in the United States, but in Greece and other parts of Europe and Asia. And I really look at what they're reading. That is, when I tell people I get my news from Facebook, I don't mean I'm reading what Facebook is putting out. But a person that I know perhaps in Israel might put out a book review of a really good book, or someone might quote an article from The Economist or from an English language daily paper in Israel or in Latin America. And something that you would never look at on your own.
Most people I think get their news sources from major media sites, whether it's CNN, BBC, MSNBC, or they have their own niche little thing that more aligns to their political agenda. And I try to avoid getting all of my news from sort of left and socialist sources,
Getting out of the bubble.
because we have an agenda too. We have a point of view that we're not necessarily providing disinformation, but it's the areas we focus on are going to be based on our politics, just whether you're on the right or left of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
So I try to get my news from a diverse set of sources. I try to read different things. I try to read things that may bring up viewpoints that I don't necessarily agree with, to try and get the understanding of what other people say. Unlike many people, I haven't deleted all my Trump friends from Facebook. I have a lot of folks who, as long as they're not too political on my spaces in social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or whatever, I don't get political on theirs. But I do try and learn where they're coming from. And I do talk to Trump voters. I talk to Hillary voters. I talk to liberals. I talk to conservatives and try and understand where they're coming from. And I think I do understand where they're coming from, particularly, believe it or not, the Trump voters. I understand why people voted for Trump.
My parents are Trump voters.
Mine, unfortunately, did not vote for Trump. Fortunately.
Unfortunately.
Well, let's rewind that one. I was trying to get around to the fact that, my parents were in a nursing home dying basically during the last election cycle. And so didn't vote for anyone.
Yeah.
And, but I think the thing is that we need to understand the opposition, and you can't just be reading your own view of the world to understand that. You need to get a well-rounded view. So I think people need to search out news sources, connect to friends who read diverse things, people who don't necessarily read the same journals you do or the same books, to get an idea of what's going on and to point you to new things. So I discover a lot of knowledge through my friends on social media.
Especially the ones you don't agree with.
I often read the people I agree with, but even the people I agree with will point me to news sources or point me to a book or an article that I would have never even known existed.
Right.
On maybe even a topic that I even know existed.
Yeah.
And you start to learn, and then you go from that article, you start doing some research on your own, you Google stuff for an hour, you get some good news sources. It's like, oh, wow, like I've just learned a lot on a particular topic that I didn't really have any clue about an hour ago. So I think people really need to do that. They can't just have their one or two favorite sources to go to.
Right.
They need to look at a diverse set of information sources, and they need to develop their own sort of philosophy. I think they need to develop, some ideas around, what's legitimate and what's not, and what's good for the people of this country and this world, and what's not, and what news sources are really just playing to prejudices, which news sources are playing to the corporate image of America.
Right.
I think people need to look at educational resources. I would point people to Howard Zinn's website, the late Professor Howard Zinn, who wrote A People's History of the United States, is, first of all, a great book for everyone to read. Even myself with a PhD in history, I learned so much reading that book. The lessons of history that were not taught in school. But also looking at his website, a lot of educational materials on there, a lot of good things to look at, to inform your viewpoints, to also maybe get you started to look at a bigger area.
If you had to point a person to a single work, so you say like Howard Zinn or something like that, but a single sort of document, something from Marx or something like that you would point somebody to as a place to maybe start, what would that be?
I would say if people really want to learn about Marxism, unfortunately, there are not a lot of great books out there that are really readable and would hold the interest of just the average person who doesn't have a lot of exposure, say, to Marx or Marxism. Honestly, it might sound a little bit weird, but I would actually have people start at Wikipedia. If you really just typed in Karl Marx and just read his biography, which is not that bad, on Wikipedia, maybe look at Marxism, maybe look at socialism as starting points, not to get your whole education about socialism and Marxism and Karl Marx, but as a jumping off point, just to get use it as a ready reference to skim the articles, use half an hour or whatever to get some basic ideas about them. And then I would start looking around at resources that would provide more information. Look at, it's hard to point to specific documents, but I would say, look at Zinn's book, People's History of the United States, not necessarily read it cover to cover. It is a history textbook, more or less. But look at particular eras that you're interested in. Maybe you might just read the last few chapters looking at, contemporary America, just to get an idea of some of the issues that we weren't taught in school, some of the issues about race and gender, about unions, things that, don't fit the corporate model of American politics.
Right.
To get some background on that, look at some of the references that Zinn quotes, some of his sources, and, meet up with other people. Once you start developing some progressive and socialist ideas, look for other people like that in your town or community. Get involved.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's honestly a great place to leave it. So, Michael, thank you. The conversation went in many different directions. I think there was a center of gravity around Russia, but that's sort of the point, right? To have a conversation that goes where it goes, and for me, just to find out more about what you think, and also interviewing for me allows me not to talk so much, which is
well, Kevin, as you know, it's always great to talk with you. I always learn a lot when I talk with you. I enjoy your ideas and I benefit from your knowledge. And thanks for having me on the podcast. I hope it's a great success.
Absolutely. And given the fact that I feel like it is already a success, just talking with you, that another conversation is necessary. A punch a Nazi conversation would be enough. Would be interesting enough. But I think a discussion of something like the history of European history, sort of just reviewing the socialist history of Europe or something like that would be a cool idea. So we'll have to do it again.
Sounds good.
But until next time, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Kevin.
Awesome. All right, that was my conversation with Michael Melinchok. Hope you found that interesting. I definitely did find it interesting. If you'd like to support the Sensible Socialist podcast, check out sensiblesocialist.com. You can check us out on iTunes. And if you'd like to support Sensible Socialist, just go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give us your support. Thanks.